So by the time of St. Paul, the Areopagus had become a place of philosophical debate. Today's Areopagus is not the hill of Athens. It is a digital space made of pixels. From the myth of Paul to John Paul II to Pope Francis, from Athens to the screens, this is the new Areopagus. Welcome to the new Areopagus. This is the second episode of our reflection from the Areopagus to the screens. And we want in this episode to explain why we have chosen the name Areopagus. And this is the entire philosophy, the style of our journey with you in faith in this digital space. So we are going to see the Areopagus and how it becomes the playbook, our model of coming to the digital space to form young people, to be better people in society, to be the best of yourself. The Areopagus, as we might have heard about, is a hill in Athens, Areopagus, the hill of Ares. And the Greeks believed that that was where the gods held their trials. So we have Ares was trialed for bloodshed. The god Orestes was trialed for killing his mother, for matricide. And eventually, the Areopagus became a moral center, a supreme court for the Athenians, where serious crimes were judged, crimes like homicide, like sacrilege. And it was not a noisy court. The Areopagus was solemn, secretive, and exacting. So it became the guardian of the ancestral law and the moral consciousness of the city. But eventually, as history shifted and democracy flourished, they created a more formal justice system and stripped the Areopagus council of its powers. So by 462 CE, 462 years before Christ, its authority was diminished as a supreme court because democracy was now forming well-functioned, very systematic courts. Yet the Areopagus was not so much weakened. It retained its own prestige and it became a new playground for debate where ideas were challenged. So that if you have your own opinions, if you have your own philosophy, you go, and that is where it was really challenged. Your ideas were challenged. So by the time of St. Paul, which we are going to read in Acts chapter 17, the Areopagus had become a place of philosophical debate. So if you have good ideas, come and let's share, come and let's discuss, come and let's debate. Acts chapter 17, verse 1 begins with St. Paul arriving in Thessalonica and started preaching to well-meaning people, to Greeks, to Jews in their synagogues, and talking about Jesus Christ who had died and who has been raised from death. And his preaching infuriated the Jews who were in Greek, who were in Thessalonica, and they sought so many ways to destroy Paul's teaching and even to eliminate him. And they incited the crowds against St. Paul, saying that St. Paul was propagating bad teaching. And St. Paul left Thessalonica to another place, Berea. And as wherever he goes, the Jews followed him to want to incite the crowd against St. Paul. Then eventually St. Paul had to be kidnapped to Athens. And he went to Athens purposely to wait for Silas and Timothy. And it was there St. Paul realized something new, something struck him. So in verse 16, St. Paul waited for them in Athens, and there his whole soul was revolted at the sight of a city given over to idolatry. Athens was a place full of idols. So St. Paul started preaching in the synagogues of Athens, talking about resurrection, talking about Jesus Christ, talking about he dying, the Son of God, coming to die for us. And his teaching attracted the attention of two Greek philosophies, two Greek schools of philosophy, the Epicureans and the Stoics. So in verse 18, even a few Epicureans and Stoic philosophers argued with him. Some said, "Does this parrot know what he's talking about?" And because he was preaching about Jesus and the resurrection, others said, "He sounds like a propagandist for some outlandish gods." So the Epicureans are the group of philosophers who think that Life, there's nothing like after death. Life is pleasure. It is the highest good. Enjoy yourself to the most. Eliminate pain as much as possible and have fun. Then the Stoics are those who believe in reason, the Logos, seeing death as a return of the universe. So while the Epicureans did not believe in life after death, the Stoics believe that when you die, you can also return. So Paul's preaching about the resurrection attracted them, and they brought him to the Areopagus Council because they saw that as a new philosophy, as a new idea, as a new thought. So Paul should come and discuss that with them. And this is where we see St. Paul's style as our style, as the best model for our presence on the social media, on the digital space. What did St. Paul do? The first thing St. Paul did was to find the common grounds, where to start from. So he understood them. And in verse 23, St. Paul started with this way: Men of Athens, I have seen for myself how extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters, because I noticed as I strolled round admiring your sacred monuments that you had an altar inscribed to an unknown God. This is the common grounds. St. Paul realizing that in all their temple they have so much gods, but because the Greeks did not want to believe that they have exhausted the number of gods in the world, they inscribed an altar and named it to an unknown God. And this is where St. Paul began, talking about this unknown God who is the creator of all things, and he created all things, even including the gods. And in finding the common ground, St. Paul began with what they have, their own poets. St. Paul quotes in verse 28, Since it is him that we live and move and exist, as indeed some of your own writers have said, we are all his children. So St. Paul begins to let the council of Areopagus realize that even their own poets have spoken about this unknown God as the source of all things, and we are all his children, relating himself to them. And from there, St. Paul talks about this God who has created everything and sent his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, to come and die for us. And after his death, he resurrected. And this is the hit point. The moment St. Paul mentioned the resurrection, his message hit the hard rock. The philosophers could not believe that there is anything like resurrection. So some mocked, some delayed, but some believed. Among them were Dionysius the Areopagite, a member of the council, and a woman named Damaris. So that is the style of St. Paul. He said to the weak he behaves like a weak, to the strong he behaves he's strong, and his task is to make sure that at least he wins one soul. You know, the gospel, Jesus told us to go to all the nations to proclaim the gospel. And for centuries later, the church, through the popes, have seen the many forms of public squares as the new Areopagus. So Paul the Cis, in Evangelii Nuntiandi, spoke of a new sectors of the human life, mass media, science, urban life, where the gospel must be preached. That was a new form of society, new form of people gathering, and that was their new Areopagus. Eventually, St. John Paul II, in Redemptoris Missio, declared the first Areopagus of the modern age is the world of communications. This is the global village of screens and sounds. And he named other Areopagi too: culture, politics, science, human rights, as the new frontiers where we must preach the gospel. And Francis continued this call in Evangelii Gaudium, where he urges us to enter the digital culture with creativity, joy, and courage. So from St. Paul to the popes, the message is clear. The church must always stand in the square, wherever humanity gathers, to seek meaning. And the steps of St. Paul should be our model. finding the common grounds, speaking the language of the digital space, and making sure that by doing so, we don't compromise the gospel. We don't water down the truth of the good news. In spite of the fact that today, digital space, everything is clickbait, snackable contents. We want short messages, dance, entertainment. People still look for meaning. People still want the truth. People still want to believe. And what should we do? We should not stand aloof. We must proclaim. So today's Areopagus is not the hill of Athens. It is a digital space made of pixels. Nearly 5 billion people log on daily. Here, friendships are formed, ideologies collide, identities are shaped, futures are contested. The challenge remains for us as church to listen as much as we speak, to find common grounds without losing the gospel's core values, to proclaim Christ with creativity, with authenticity, and with courage. And this is our new market space. And the Areopagus is here, our screens in our hands. From the myth of Paul to John Paul II to Pope Francis, from Athens to the screens, the Areopagus reminds us faith is never lived in isolation. It always steps into the square to dialogue, to challenge, to inspire. Today's square is digital, so the question remains, when you enter the digital world, will you stand there with the wisdom of Athens, the courage of Paul, and the hope of the gospel? This is the new Areopagus. Follow us, subscribe to our channels, and join us grow this project so that you, the young people, will have meaning in life, will have something to believe in, and you understand the will of God for you.